When my family drove off and left me stranded at Denver International Airport 3 hours before my emergency heart surgery, I thought I'd hit rock bottom. What I didn't know was that their abandonment would lead me to discover something that would change everything. Not just about my recovery, but about who I really was and what I was truly capable of. 6 months later, they came crawling back, but by then, I had already rebuilt my entire life without them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Faye Alexander. I'm 52 years old, and I never imagined that the worst day of my life would start with me clutching a small overnight bag in the departure lounge of Denver International Airport, watching my sister's red Honda Civic disappear into the parking garage, while my chest felt like it was being crushed in a vice. The cardiac surgeon had been clear when he called that morning. I needed to be in Boston by 6 p.m. for emergency surgery the next day. A blockage in my left anterior descending artery, the one they call the widowmaker, had been discovered during what was supposed to be a routine stress test. I had been living in Colorado Springs for the past 15 years, working as a high school English teacher, divorced, no children, and the closest family I had was my younger sister Monica and her husband Derek. When Dr. Patterson's office called with the emergency referral to Massachusetts General Hospital, Monica was the first person I reached out to. She seemed genuinely concerned, asked all the right questions, and immediately offered to drive me to the airport. Derek even took the day off work to come along, saying family should stick together during times like this. The morning had started normally enough. I packed light, just essentials for what I hoped would be a short stay. Monica arrived at my small ranch house on Cascade Avenue right on time, engine running, Derek in the passenger seat scrolling through his phone. The drive to Denver should have taken about 90 minutes, but traffic was heavier than usual, and I found myself checking my phone obsessively, calculating whether we'd make it in time for my 3 o'clock flight. Monica chatted nervously during the drive, asking questions about my insurance, whether I'd notified my principal at Roosevelt High School, if I'd arranged for someone to water my plants. Normal sister concerns, I thought. Derek contributed occasional grunts and continued staring at his screen. I assumed he was dealing with work emails, being the devoted husband taking time off to help his sister-in-law in a crisis. We pulled into the departure drop-off area with 40 minutes to spare. I grabbed my bag from the back seat, checking once more that I had my insurance cards, the referral paperwork, and my phone charger. Monica rolled down her window and said she'd call me later to check in. Derek finally looked up from his phone and gave me a tight smile, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes. I walked into the terminal feeling grateful for their support, despite the circumstances. The check-in process was smooth, security moved faster than expected, and I found myself at gate B27, with time to spare. That's when I realized I'd left my prescription medications in Monica's car, the blood pressure medication and anxiety pills I'd been taking since my divorce 2 years earlier. Nothing critical for the surgery, but medications I'd need for the recovery period. I called Monica immediately. She answered on the second ring, sounding distracted. When I explained about the medications, there was a long pause. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "Oh, we're already on the highway heading back. We can't turn around now, traffic's terrible." I suggested they could mail them to me at the hospital, or maybe drop them off at the front desk for me to pick up later. Another pause, this one longer. "Look, Faye," she said, and I could hear Derek saying something in the background. "We've got plans tonight. Emma's recital is at 7, and we promised we'd be there. Can't you just get the prescriptions refilled in Boston?" Emma was their 8-year-old daughter, my niece, and of course her recital was important. But something in Monica's tone felt off, rushed in a way that didn't match the situation. I told her I understood about the recital, but wondered if Derek could quickly run the medications to the airport while she got Emma ready. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Monica said, "We're not coming back to the airport, Faye. You'll have to figure it out." And she hung up. I stared at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. My sister, the person I'd helped through her difficult pregnancy, the one I'd lent money to when Derek was between jobs, the sister who'd cried on my shoulder when our parents died within 6 months of each other 5 years ago, had just told me to figure it out. 3 hours before I was supposed to fly across the country for emergency heart surgery, I called back immediately. Straight to voicemail. I tried Derek's number. Same thing. I sat in that uncomfortable airport chair, surrounded by travelers rushing to their gates, families saying goodbye, business people talking loudly on their phones, and I felt more alone than I had since my divorce. The logical part of my brain kicked in. I could manage without the medications for a few days. The prescription bottles had the pharmacy information, and I could call my doctor's office to have them transferred to a Boston pharmacy. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't catastrophic either. What bothered me more was the feeling that I'd been dismissed, like my emergency surgery was an inconvenience they'd tolerated long enough. I tried calling Monica one more time as passengers began boarding my flight. This time she answered but sounded annoyed. What now, Faye? We're at Emma's school. I kept my voice steady, not wanting to create a scene in the crowded gate area. I just wanted to make sure you understood. This is emergency surgery. If something goes wrong, if there are complications, I need you to know where I am, what's happening. You'll be fine, she said quickly. You're stronger than you think. Look, I have to go. Emma's about to perform. And once again, she hung up. That's when it hit me. I was completely alone. No family member knew my flight details, the name of the surgeon, or even which hospital I'd be at. I'd been so focused on getting to Boston that I hadn't considered what would happen if things went badly. Who would they call? Who would make decisions if I couldn't? I boarded the plane with a hollow feeling in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. The flight attendant, a woman about my age named Sarah, noticed I seemed distressed and asked if I was okay. I found myself explaining the situation, not because I wanted sympathy, but because I needed someone, anyone, to know where I was going and why. Sarah listened with the kind of attention that made me realize how long it had been since someone had really heard me. She took down my information, the hospital details, and even gave me her personal phone number, saying she'd check on me after her shift. A stranger showed more concern for my well-being than my own family had. During the flight, I kept replaying the conversations with Monica, trying to understand what had gone wrong. We'd never been particularly close, but we'd maintained a cordial relationship after our parents' deaths. I'd thought we were family, that blood meant something, that in a crisis we'd show up for each other. Apparently, I'd been wrong. I landed in Boston at 7:30 p.m., took a taxi to Massachusetts General Hospital, and checked into the cardiac unit. The night shift nurse, Patricia, was kind and efficient, walking me through the pre-surgery procedures, explaining what would happen the next morning. When she asked about my emergency contact, I hesitated. I could give her Monica's information, but after today, I wasn't sure she'd even answer if the hospital called. Instead, I gave her Sarah's number, explaining that she was a friend who'd be concerned about the outcome. Patricia raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. She'd probably seen stranger things in her years of nursing. That night, lying in the narrow hospital bed, listening to the beeping monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to spend my recovery waiting for my family to remember they cared about me. I was going to figure out how to build a life that didn't depend on people who saw me as an obligation, rather than a person worth showing up for. The surgery went well. Dr. Martinez, the cardiac surgeon, was skilled and reassuring. The blockage was cleared, a stent was placed, and I woke up in the cardiac ICU feeling like I'd been given a second chance. Sarah called that evening to check on me, and I found myself crying, not from pain or fear, but from gratitude that someone cared enough to follow through on a promise. I spent 4 days in the hospital, and during that time, I discovered something that changed my entire perspective on my situation. While going through my insurance paperwork, I found a letter I'd forgotten about, tucked behind my insurance cards. It was from my father's estate attorney, dated 3 months earlier, informing me that a trust established by my paternal grandmother had finally been settled. The letter mentioned that I was the sole beneficiary of what had been a modest savings account that had been invested and growing for the past 20 years. I called the attorney's office from my hospital bed, expecting to learn about a few $1,000s, maybe enough to help with my medical bills. What I discovered made me sit up so straight that it triggered the heart monitor alarm. The trust was worth $1. $3 million. My grandmother, who'd lived simply and died when I was in college, had been far more financially savvy than anyone in the family had realized. The attorney, Mr. Henley, explained that my grandmother had specifically structured the trust to remain private until it reached maturity, which had happened on my 52nd birthday 3 months ago. The letter had been sent to my address, but in the chaos of the school year ending and my routine medical appointments, I'd filed it away without opening it. Now, sitting in a hospital bed 3,000 miles from home, recovering from emergency heart surgery, I learned that I was wealthy. Mr. Henley asked if I wanted to begin the process of accessing the funds. I told him I'd call back in a few days, after I'd had time to process everything. But even as I said it, I knew this discovery was going to change how I approached my recovery and my future. I was discharged on a Friday morning with strict instructions to rest, take my medications, and follow up with a cardiologist in Colorado Springs. As I waited for my taxi to the airport, I realized I hadn't heard from Monica once during my entire hospital stay. Not a text, not a call, not even a message through social media. It was as if I'd simply vanished from her life the moment they drove away from the airport. The flight back to Colorado was uneventful, but I found myself thinking about the trust, about my grandmother, about the fact that I'd been living paycheck to paycheck as a teacher when I had resources that could change everything. I'd been careful with money, lived modestly, driven the same Honda Accord for 8 years, bought my clothes on sale. Not because I was poor, but because I'd been raised to be practical, to save for emergencies, to not be a burden on anyone. Now I realized that my definition of not being a burden had somehow extended to not expecting my family to care about me during an actual emergency. I'd been so focused on being self-sufficient that I'd forgotten I deserved to be supported, especially during a health crisis. My house felt different when I returned. The same furniture, the same books lining the shelves, the same photos of Monica's family on the refrigerator. But something had shifted. I wasn't the same person who'd left for the airport 5 days earlier. I'd been abandoned when I needed support most, and I'd survived it. More than survived, I discovered I had options I'd never imagined. I called in sick to work for the following week, doctor's orders, and spent the time researching my options. I called Mr. Henley back and started the process of accessing the trust. I researched cardiac rehabilitation programs, not just in Colorado Springs, but everywhere. I looked into early retirement options for teachers, sabbatical programs, travel opportunities for people recovering from heart surgery. For the first time in years, I felt like I was planning a life, rather than just managing one. Monica finally called on Sunday afternoon, 6 days after my surgery. She sounded casual, almost cheerful, asking how everything went as if I'd been on a vacation rather than having my chest cracked open for emergency surgery. I told her the surgery had gone well, that I was home and recovering. She said she was glad to hear it, and mentioned that Emma's recital had been wonderful.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
She didn't apologize for not calling sooner. She didn't ask about my recovery process or whether I needed anything. She talked about Emma's piano progress and Derek's promotion at work. Normal family conversation that felt completely tone-deaf given the circumstances. Finally, she said, quote, "I know we couldn't make it to the airport last week, but that all worked out, right? You figured it out like I knew you would." I paused, letting her words sink in. She'd rewritten the story in her mind, turning their abandonment into confidence in my abilities. I could have corrected her, explained how frightened and alone I'd felt, described what it was like to face major surgery without family support. Instead, I said something that surprised both of us. Yes, I figured it out. I figured out a lot of things, actually. There was a silence, and then Monica laughed awkwardly. Well, that's good. That's the Faye we know, always landing on her feet. After we hung up, I sat in my living room looking at the photos of Monica's family and realized something profound. They hadn't abandoned me at the airport out of cruelty or malice. They'd abandoned me because they'd never really seen me as someone who needed or deserved their support. In their minds, I was the capable older sister who always figured things out, who never asked for help, who could handle anything life threw at her. But capability and independence shouldn't mean facing life-threatening surgery alone. Being strong shouldn't mean being isolated. And I was done accepting that it did. I spent the next few weeks working with Mr. Henley to access the trust funds and planning what would become the most transformative period of my life. I wasn't going to use my newfound wealth to punish my family or prove a point. I was going to use it to build the life I'd always wanted but never believed I deserved. The first thing I did was resign from Roosevelt High School. I'd been teaching for 28 years, and while I'd enjoyed working with students, I'd stayed in the job long after it stopped challenging me because it was safe, predictable, and provided good insurance. Now, with my financial situation completely changed, I could afford to take risks. I enrolled in a cardiac rehabilitation program in Boulder, an hour north of Colorado Springs, that included not just physical therapy, but counseling, nutritional guidance, and stress management techniques. 3 times a week, I drove through the mountains to work with a team of professionals who were focused on helping me build a healthier, more sustainable life. Dr. Amanda Ross, the program director, was the first person who helped me understand that my heart attack wasn't just a medical event. It was a wake-up call about how I'd been living. The stress of trying to be everything to everyone, of never setting boundaries, of accepting crumbs of affection from people who should have been offering full meals, had literally been killing me. During one of our sessions, Dr. Ross asked me to describe my support system. I started to mention Monica, then stopped. "I don't think I have one," I said finally. "I thought I did, but when I needed it most, it wasn't there." Dr. Ross nodded. "That's more common than you might think. Sometimes we confuse being useful to people with being loved by them. They're not the same thing." Her words hit me like a revelation. I'd been useful to Monica, the reliable sister who could be counted on to lend money, babysit Emma, provide emotional support during her rough patches. But when I'd needed support in return, I'd been seen as an inconvenience. I started building a new support system, starting with the people I met in cardiac rehabilitation. There was Robert, a retired professor who'd had a heart attack at 65 and was now training for his first marathon. There was Carmen, a single mother of 3 who'd survived a massive heart attack at 38 and was determined to be around to see her children graduate from college. There was Frank, a widower who'd lost his wife to cancer and then nearly lost himself to a heart attack brought on by grief. These people understood what I'd been through because they'd been through it themselves. They celebrated small victories like walking a mile without chest pain, eating a meal without anxiety, sleeping through the night without waking up in a panic. They created a community based on shared experience and mutual support, not blood relation or social obligation. I started attending the group's weekly dinners, potluck gatherings where we'd share healthy recipes and talk about our progress. I joined their weekend hiking group, gentle trails through the foothills that gradually built my endurance and confidence. I participated in their book club, reading memoirs of people who'd overcome significant health challenges and rebuilt their lives. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Meanwhile, I was working with a financial advisor to understand my options with the trust money. I'd never had significant wealth before, and I wanted to be smart about how I used it. I paid off my mortgage, set aside money for ongoing medical expenses, and invested the rest conservatively. But I also decided to do something I'd never allowed myself to consider. I was going to travel. Not just vacation travel, but extended trips to places I'd only read about in books. I'd spent my entire adult life being responsible, practical, available to others. Now I was going to be available to myself. I planned a 3-month trip to New Zealand, a country I'd been fascinated by since reading about it in college. I booked a small cottage in the South Island, enrolled in a cooking class in Christchurch, and arranged to volunteer at a wildlife sanctuary in Dunedin. I was going to spend my recovery period on the other side of the world, healing in a place where no one knew me as the dependable sister or the dedicated teacher. Monica called while I was researching flights. She sounded excited about something, talking rapidly about a family vacation they were planning for Christmas. "We're thinking of renting a cabin in Breckenridge," she said. "You should come with us. Emma would love to have her aunt there for Christmas morning." I let her talk, describing the cabin, the planned activities, the Christmas traditions they wanted to establish. When she finally paused, I said, "I won't be here for Christmas. I'm going to be in New Zealand." The silence was so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she said, "New Zealand? Why? For how long?" I explained about my plans, the cottage, the cooking classes, the volunteer work. I told her about my cardiac rehabilitation program, the support group, the way I'd been rebuilding my life since the surgery. I mentioned the trust money, not to brag, but to explain how I was able to make such a significant change. Monica's response was immediate and sharp. "You inherited money and didn't tell us?" How much money? I felt something shift inside me, a clarity I hadn't experienced before, enough to live comfortably without worrying about anyone else's approval of my choices. That's not what I meant, Monica said, and I could hear the irritation in her voice. I meant, don't you think families should know about something like this? Don't you think we have a right to know what's going on in your life? The irony was staggering. She was talking about family rights and being included in my life, 6 weeks after abandoning me at the airport before emergency surgery. I almost laughed. Monica, I said, keeping my voice steady, you left me at the airport 3 hours before I had to fly across the country for emergency heart surgery. You didn't call once while I was in the hospital. You didn't ask how I was recovering or whether I needed anything. You haven't shown interest in my life in years unless you needed something from me. What exactly makes you think you have a right to information about my finances? The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Not empty, but full of all the things we'd never said to each other. Finally, Monica said, That's not fair. We've always been there for you. No, I said quietly. You've always been there for me to be there for you. That's not the same thing. We hung up without resolving anything, but I felt lighter somehow. I'd finally said what I'd been thinking for years, what I'd been afraid to acknowledge even to myself. I wasn't angry at Monica and Derek for being who they were. I was angry at myself for accepting so little, for so long. The next few weeks were busy with trip preparations, but also with an unexpected development. Dr. Ross from the Cardiac Rehabilitation Program called to ask if I'd be interested in sharing my story with other heart patients. She'd been impressed by my progress, not just physically but emotionally, and thought other patients might benefit from hearing about my experience. I agreed to speak at their monthly support group meeting, expecting to address maybe 15 people. Instead, I found myself in a room with over 40 heart patients and their families, all eager to hear about recovery and rebuilding. I talked about the importance of building a genuine support system, about not confusing being useful with being loved, about the freedom that comes from investing in yourself rather than waiting for others to invest in you. After the talk, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She was about my age, recently divorced, and had just survived a heart attack. She said my story had given her hope that she could build a new life, that she didn't have to settle for being grateful for whatever scraps of attention her family offered. That conversation led to another speaking engagement, then another. I found myself becoming an advocate for heart patients, particularly women who'd been conditioned to prioritize everyone else's needs over their own health and well-being. By the time I left for New Zealand, I had a waiting list of speaking requests and an invitation to write about my experience for a medical journal. I'd accidentally discovered a purpose that felt more meaningful than anything I'd done in years. The trip to New Zealand exceeded every expectation I'd had. I spent 3 months in a cottage overlooking Lake Wanaka, walking the trails, learning to cook local cuisine, and volunteering at a wildlife sanctuary where I helped rehabilitate injured birds. I learned to kayak, took a photography class, and read novels by authors I'd never had time to discover. But the most important thing I did was think. For the first time in my adult life, I had extended periods of solitude that weren't interrupted by work obligations, family drama, or social expectations. I could sit by the lake in the morning with my coffee and think about what I wanted my life to look like, not what other people expected it to look like. I realized that I'd spent so many years being afraid of being alone that I'd never learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. In New Zealand, surrounded by strangers who became friends, pursuing activities that interested me, I was alone much of the time but rarely lonely. Monica called twice during my trip, both times sounding strained and asking when I was coming home. I told her I wasn't sure, that I was considering extending my stay. The second call ended with her saying, "I don't understand what's happened to you, Faye. You used to be so reliable." I realized she was right. I used to be reliable in all the ways that served her needs. I used to be available when she needed someone to talk to, generous when she needed financial help, understanding when she needed to cancel plans or prioritize her own family. I used to be reliable about accepting whatever level of relationship she was willing to offer. Now I was reliable about something else. I was reliable about prioritizing my own well-being and not accepting less than I deserved from the people in my life. When I finally returned to Colorado Springs after 4 months away, I felt like a different person. I'd lost weight, gained muscle, and developed a confidence I'd never had before. I looked healthy in a way that went beyond just recovering from surgery. Local news stations covered the event, and I was interviewed about my own recovery journey and the importance of comprehensive support for heart patients. Monica and Derek attended the gala, along with Emma. It was the first time I'd seen them since before my surgery, and I was struck by how different our dynamic felt. They seemed almost nervous around me, uncertain about how to interact with this version of their sister and sister-in-law. During the cocktail hour, Monica pulled me aside. "I'm really proud of what you've accomplished," she said. "I had no idea you were capable of something like this." Her words stung, even though I knew she meant them as a compliment. She'd had no idea I was capable of building something meaningful because she'd never seen me as anything more than a supporting character in her life story. "I'm not surprised," I said. "You never really asked what I was capable of." Monica looked hurt. "That's not fair, Faye. We've always supported you." I looked around the room at the people who'd actually supported me. Dr. Ross, who'd helped me understand the connection between emotional and physical health. Robert, Carmen, and Frank from my cardiac rehabilitation group, who'd become genuine friends. Sarah, the flight attendant who'd called to check on me after my surgery and had become a regular pen pal. The staff and volunteers at Second Chances, who believed in the work we were doing. "No," I said finally. "You've always expected me to support you. That's not the same thing." The conversation ended there, but I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry at Monica anymore. I was grateful to her, in a way, because her abandonment had forced me to discover who I was when I wasn't trying to be useful to someone else. The evening was a success beyond my expectations. We raised money for our programs, but more importantly, we raised awareness about the comprehensive support heart patients needed. Several other hospitals expressed interest in partnering with us, and I realized that Second Chances could become something much larger than I'd originally envisioned. As the evening wound down, I found myself on the hotel's terrace, looking out at the mountains that had become my home in a way they'd never been before. Dr. Ross joined me, and we stood in comfortable silence for a moment. "You know," she said finally, "when I first met you, I was worried you might not survive the emotional aspects of recovery. Not because you weren't strong enough, but because you were so focused on taking care of everyone else that you'd forgotten how to take care of yourself." I thought about that observation, about the woman who'd been wheeled into cardiac rehabilitation 8 months earlier, frightened and alone and convinced that she'd somehow failed by needing help. "I almost didn't," I said. "But failing to get support from the people I expected it from forced me to find support from people who actually wanted to give it." Dr. Ross nodded. "Sometimes the worst thing that happens to us creates space for the best thing to happen to us." As I drove home that night, I thought about the woman who'd stood in Denver International Airport nearly a year earlier, abandoned by her family and terrified of facing surgery alone. I thought about how that abandonment had led to every good thing that had happened since. The trust money that gave me options. The cardiac rehabilitation program that introduced me to real friendship. The speaking opportunities that revealed a purpose I'd never known I had. The nonprofit that was helping other people rebuild their lives after their heart events. I thought about Monica and Derek, still living the same life they'd always lived, still prioritizing the same things, still seeing me as the sister who'd always been there and always would be, regardless of how they treated me. But I wasn't that sister anymore. I was someone who'd learned the difference between being useful and being valued, between being needed and being loved, between being reliable for others and being reliable for myself. I'd learned that sometimes the people who abandon you do you the greatest favor of all. They force you to discover that you don't need them as much as you thought you did. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they force you to discover that you're capable of much more than you ever imagined. The success of the gala marked a turning point that I hadn't anticipated. Within weeks, I was receiving calls from hospitals in Denver, Fort Collins, and even as far away as Phoenix, asking about replicating our model. The attention was flattering, but it also made me realize that what I'd started as a personal healing journey had become something much larger. I was sitting in my new office on a Tuesday morning, reviewing partnership proposals, when my assistant Jennifer knocked on the door. She looked uncomfortable. which was unusual for someone who'd handled everything from difficult insurance companies to grieving family members without batting an eye. "There's someone here to see you," she said carefully. "She says she's your sister, but she doesn't have an appointment." I looked up from the stack of papers on my desk, feeling my chest tighten slightly. Monica hadn't called or texted in the 3 weeks since the gala, and her sudden appearance at my office felt ominous rather than familial. "Send her in," I said, closing the folder I'd been reviewing and taking a slow breath. Monica walked into my office wearing the kind of outfit she typically reserved for important occasions: a navy blue dress, matching heels, and the pearl necklace that had belonged to our mother. She looked around the space with obvious curiosity, taking in the awards on the wall, the photos from various speaking engagements, and the large window that overlooked the garden where our patients practiced their rehabilitation exercises. "This is impressive," she said, but her tone suggested the opposite. "Much bigger than I expected." I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same spot where I met with patients and their families, where I'd had some of the most meaningful conversations of my professional life. Monica sat down but remained perched on the edge, as if she might need to leave quickly. "What can I do for you, Monica?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She opened her purse and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, placing it on my desk between us. It was the article about second chances from the Colorado Springs Gazette, complete with the photo of me at the gala and a detailed description of the organization's mission and funding. "I read this," she said. "The reporter mentioned that you'd received a significant inheritance that helped you start the organization. They estimated the startup costs at over $500,000. I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "Faye, I've been thinking about our conversation at the gala, about family support and all that. I realize maybe Derek and I could have handled things differently when you had your surgery. Maybe we were more focused on our own stress than on what you needed." This was the closest thing to an apology I had ever received from Monica, and I found myself studying her face, trying to determine whether it was genuine or calculated. The timing, coming so soon after the newspaper article, suggested the latter. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. Monica leaned forward slightly. "The thing is, I've been talking to Derek about our financial situation. Emma's getting older, and we're starting to think about college costs. Derek's job is secure, but we're not really building wealth, you know. We're just maintaining." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I could see exactly where this conversation was heading. "And then I read about your organization, about the inheritance you received, and I realized that maybe this is an opportunity for our family to work together. I could help you with the business side of things. Derek has experience with marketing. We could make this a real family enterprise." I sat back in my chair, processing what she'd just said. Monica wanted to insert herself and Derek into my organization, not because they believed in the mission or had relevant experience, but because they'd learned I had access to significant money. "What kind of help are you thinking about?" I asked. Monica's eyes brightened, apparently taking my question as interest rather than skepticism. "Well, I've been researching nonprofit management, and I think you could really benefit from someone with business experience. I could handle the financial side, maybe take over some of the administrative responsibilities so you can focus on the patient care aspects." She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of screenshots she'd taken of job postings for nonprofit executives. "Look at these salaries," she said excitedly. "Executive directors of organizations this size typically make 6 figures. You could afford to pay fair market rates for experienced help." I stared at the phone screen, feeling a familiar disappointment wash over me. Monica had done her research, but not about heart disease, or patient advocacy, or nonprofit best practices. She'd researched how much money she could make by involving herself in my work. "And Derek could handle marketing and public relations," she continued. "He's great with social media, and he understands how to build brand awareness. We could really expand your reach, maybe even take this national." I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw someone I didn't recognize. Or maybe I was seeing her clearly, for the first time. She wasn't here because she'd had some revelation about family relationships, or because she wanted to support my work. She was here because she'd realized I had money, and she wanted access to it. "Monica," I said slowly, "what do you know about cardiac rehabilitation?" She blinked. clearly not expecting the question. Well, I know it's important. I know people need support after heart attacks. What do you know about nonprofit governance? Grant writing? Medical advocacy? Her confidence wavered slightly. I could learn. I'm a fast learner, and I have good business instincts. I nodded thoughtfully. And what drew you to this work? What about our mission resonates with you personally? Monica seemed to realize she was failing some kind of test, but she couldn't figure out what the right answers were. I want to help people, she said finally. And I want to help you. We're family, Faye. We should be working together. I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked our garden. Robert was out there with a new patient, showing her how to use the walking meditation path we'd installed last month. Carmen was leading a group through gentle stretching exercises, each movement designed to rebuild strength without straining recovering hearts. Frank was sitting on one of the benches with another recent widower, both of them holding coffee cups and talking quietly about grief and healing. These people had found each other through shared experience, mutual support, and genuine care. They'd built relationships based on understanding and reciprocity, not convenience or financial opportunity. Monica, I said, turning back to face her, can you tell me why you didn't visit me in the hospital? The question clearly caught her off guard. What does that have to do with anything? Can you tell me why you didn't call to check on me during my recovery? Faye, that was almost a year ago. I thought we'd moved past all that. Can you tell me why your first response to learning about my inheritance was to ask how much money it was, rather than to ask how I was planning to use it? Monica's face flushed. I don't think that's fair. I was surprised, that's all. I walked back to my desk and sat down, placing my hands flat on the surface between us. Monica, I love you because you're my sister. But love doesn't mean I have to ignore patterns of behavior that have been consistent for years. What patterns? She asked, her voice rising slightly. The pattern where you show interest in my life only when you need something from me. The pattern where you disappear when I need support and reappear when you think I might be useful to you. The pattern where you assume that family obligations flow in one direction. Monica stood up abruptly, her purse clutched tightly in her hands. I can't believe you're bringing up ancient history. I came here to offer help, to try to build something together as a family. And you're acting like I'm some kind of gold digger. I'm not acting like anything, I said calmly. I'm observing that your interest in my work began exactly when you learned about my financial resources, not when you learned about my health crisis or my recovery journey. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to decide whether to continue arguing or change tactics. Finally, she chose a third option. You know what, Faye? Maybe Derek was right. Maybe you have changed, and not for the better. The sister I grew up with would have been excited to include family in something important to her. The sister I grew up with wouldn't have turned a simple offer of help into some kind of character assassination. I felt a familiar urge to apologize, to smooth things over, to find a way to make Monica feel better about a situation that was entirely of her own making. For years, I'd responded to her manipulations by trying harder to be understanding, more accommodating, more willing to overlook behavior that hurt me. But sitting in my office, surrounded by evidence of what I'd built when I stopped prioritizing other people's comfort over my own well-being, I felt no urge to apologize at all. You're right, I said. I have changed. The sister you grew up with would have said yes to whatever you asked, regardless of whether it was good for me or good for the organization. The sister you grew up with would have felt guilty for having resources you didn't have access to. The sister you grew up with would have prioritized your feelings over the mission of this organization. Monica's eyes narrowed. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with caring about family? Nothing, I said. But there's a difference between caring about family and using family. There's a difference between wanting to help and wanting to benefit. She turned toward the door, then stopped and looked back at me. You know, when you were in the hospital, I thought about calling. But Derek said you probably needed space to focus on your recovery. He said you'd call if you needed anything. I felt my heart rate increase slightly, the way it did sometimes when I was confronted with information that required recalibrating my understanding of a situation. And when you didn't call, Monica continued, we figured you were handling everything fine, Like you always do. We didn't want to bother you. I studied her face, trying to determine whether this was genuine explanation or retroactive justification. Monica, when someone has emergency heart surgery, the assumption shouldn't be that they're fine unless they prove otherwise. The assumption should be that they need support unless they specifically say they don't. We're not mind readers, Faye. We can't know what you need if you don't tell us. I shouldn't have had to tell you that I needed support during a medical emergency. That should have been obvious. Monica shook her head, and I could see her building up to a final argument. You know what I think? I think you wanted us to fail. I think you wanted to have something to hold over us, something to make us feel guilty about. I think you've been waiting for an excuse to cut us out of your life, and my surgery gave you the perfect opportunity. The accusation hit me like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it revealed how completely Monica misunderstood both me and the situation. She genuinely believed that I'd orchestrated my own abandonment as some kind of elaborate test designed to make her look bad. Monica, I said quietly, if I wanted to cut you out of my life, I wouldn't need an excuse. I'm a grown woman. If I didn't want a relationship with you, I simply wouldn't have one. She opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she walked to the door and paused with her hand on the handle. I hope you're happy with your new life, she said, her voice tight with anger. I hope all these new friends and patients and admirers fill whatever hole you think we left in your life. But don't come crying to us when you realize that charity work and professional success don't replace family. After she left, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the newspaper clipping she'd left on my desk. The article described me as a heart attack survivor who'd transformed her own recovery experience into a mission to help others. It mentioned my speaking engagements, the success of our programs, and the growth we'd experienced in our first year. What it didn't mention was the cost of that transformation, the relationships that had been casualties of my decision to prioritize my own well-being. Reading about my life in the newspaper, I sounded like someone who'd made a series of positive choices that led to obvious good outcomes. The reality was more complicated. I'd lost my relationship with my sister, and probably with Derek and Emma by extension. I'd given up a stable teaching career that had provided structure and purpose for nearly 3 decades. I'd moved away from the careful, predictable life I'd built in favor of something riskier and more demanding. But as I looked out my window at Robert helping another patient discover that her body was stronger than she'd feared, as I thought about the support group meeting scheduled for that evening, where a dozen people would share their fears and victories with others who truly understood them, as I considered the speaking engagement I had next week, where I'd help other heart patients understand that they deserved comprehensive support during their recovery, I knew I'd made the right choices. My phone buzzed with a text from Carmen asking if I wanted to join the hiking group for their Saturday morning walk through Garden of the Gods. These were the people who'd celebrated with me when I'd walked my first mile without chest pain, who'd listened when I'd talked about my fears of having another heart attack, who'd encouraged me when I doubted whether I was qualified to start an organization or speak publicly about my experience. I texted back that I'd love to join them, then returned to the partnership proposals on my desk. A hospital in Albuquerque wanted to pilot our family education program. A cardiac rehabilitation center in Kansas City was interested in our peer support model. A medical school in Denver had asked me to speak to their students about patient advocacy. The work was expanding beyond what I'd ever imagined, but it was expanding organically, driven by genuine need and authentic connections rather than by obligation or guilt. That evening, I facilitated our weekly support group meeting. 12 people sat in a circle in our main meeting room, ranging in age from 34 to 78, each at a different stage of their recovery journey. There was Lisa, a marketing executive who'd had a heart attack at 34 and was struggling with anxiety about returning to a high-stress job. There was William, a retired mechanic who'd survived a massive heart attack and was learning to navigate life with significant dietary restrictions. There was Patricia, a grandmother who'd postponed her own medical care while caring for her husband through his cancer treatment, only to have a heart attack herself 6 months after his funeral. We went around the circle sharing updates on our week, celebrating small victories and acknowledging ongoing challenges. Lisa had successfully returned to work part-time without experiencing panic attacks. William had discovered a new recipe for heart-healthy chili that actually tasted good. Patricia had started dating again after 2 years of widowhood. But the most significant share came from David, a soft-spoken accountant in his 50s who'd been attending the group for 6 months. He'd had his heart attack while working late at his office, alone, and had spent weeks in the hospital with complications. His adult children lived on the East Coast and had visited briefly but hadn't been able to stay for his recovery period. "I need to tell you all something," David said, his voice shaking slightly. "Last Tuesday was the anniversary of my heart attack. I'd been dreading it for weeks, expecting it to be this terrible, depressing day where I just thought about everything I'd lost." He paused and looked around the circle at the faces that had become familiar and dear to him over the past months. "But instead, I spent the day thinking about everything I'd gained. I thought about this group, about the friends I've made, about the volunteer work I've started doing with the hospital. I thought about how much stronger I am now, not just physically, but emotionally. I thought about how I've learned to ask for help when I need it, and how I've stopped apologizing for having needs." David's eyes filled with tears, but he was smiling. "A year ago, I thought having a heart attack was the worst thing that could happen to me. And in some ways, it was terrible. But it also forced me to rebuild my life in a way that actually works for me, instead of just getting by. It forced me to find people who see me as more than just someone who shows up and does what's expected." I felt my own eyes filling with tears as I listened to David articulate something I'd been struggling to put into words for months. His heart attack, like mine, had been a crisis that revealed the inadequacy of his existing support system. But unlike some people who simply tried to return to their previous life with minor modifications, David had used his recovery period to build something entirely new. After the meeting ended and people were saying their goodbyes, Patricia approached me. She was one of the most insightful members of our group, someone who'd learned to navigate complex family dynamics while prioritizing her own health needs. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. I nodded. "I've noticed that you never talk about your family during group. You mention friends, colleagues, people from your cardiac rehab program, but never family. Is that intentional?" I considered her question carefully. Patricia had shared plenty about her own family struggles, including adult children who'd been more concerned about their inheritance than her recovery, and siblings who'd disappeared when she'd needed practical help. "It's not intentional exactly," I said finally. "It's just that my family wasn't part of my recovery process. They weren't part of the support system that helped me rebuild my life." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "Are they part of your life now?" "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "I think we're all still figuring out what our relationship looks like when it's not based on me being available to meet their needs." "That's hard," Patricia said. "I went through something similar with my kids after Harold died. They expected me to be the same grieving widow forever, someone they could check on occasionally and feel good about themselves. When I started dating and traveling and making my own plans, they acted like I was betraying Harold's memory." She adjusted her purse and looked toward the door where other group members were still chatting. "But you know what I learned? People who love you want you to be happy and healthy, even if your happiness doesn't look like what they expected. People who just want you to be useful get upset when you prioritize your own well-being." After Patricia left, I turned off the lights in the meeting room and walked through the building, checking that everything was secure for the night. The offices were quiet, but the space still felt alive with the energy of the conversations that had taken place there that day. In addition to the support group, we'd hosted a cooking class for heart patients, a workshop on stress management, and individual counseling sessions for people struggling with anxiety about their cardiac health. 6 months ago, this had been an empty office building. Now it was a place where people came to heal, to learn, to connect with others who understood their experience. We'd helped over 200 patients through our various programs, and the feedback we received consistently emphasized the same themes. Patients felt heard, supported, and empowered to take control of their recovery process. I was locking the front door when my phone rang. It was an unknown number with a Colorado area code. "Hello? Ms. Alexander? This is Dr. Jennifer Martinez from Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital in Denver. I hope I'm not calling too late." I recognized the name from one of the partnership proposals I'd been reviewing. "Not at all. What can I do for you?" I wanted to follow up on our conversation about bringing your peer support program to our cardiac unit. I've been talking with my colleagues, and we're very interested in moving forward. But I also wanted to ask if you'd consider taking on a more formal role with our hospital system. I felt my pulse quicken slightly. What kind of role? We're creating a new position, Director of Cardiac Patient Advocacy. It would involve overseeing patient support services across all our cardiac units, developing educational programs, and serving as a liaison between patients and medical staff. The person in this role would also be responsible for training other hospitals in our network. Dr. Martinez paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. The salary range is $120,000 to $150,000, plus benefits and a budget for program development. You'd have a staff of 6 and office space at our main campus. Most importantly, you'd have the resources to expand your work significantly. I walked to my car slowly, processing what she'd just offered me. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I would have been terrified to pursue a year ago, when I was still thinking of myself as just a high school English teacher who'd happened to survive a heart attack. That sounds incredible, I said. Can I ask how you heard about my work? Actually, it was Dr. Ross from Boulder who recommended you. She speaks very highly of your program and your advocacy skills. But I've also been following your speaking engagements, and I was at your gala last month. What you've built is exactly what our patients need. I reached my car and stood beside it for a moment, looking back at the building that housed Second Chances. I'd put so much of myself into creating this organization, and it had become more than just a job or even a mission. It was proof that I could build something meaningful when I stopped waiting for permission from other people. Dr. Martinez, I'm very interested, but I'd need to understand how this would affect my current organization. Second Chances is important to me, and I wouldn't want to abandon the patients and staff who depend on it. We've actually thought about that, she said. We'd like to contract with Second Chances to provide services to our hospital system. You could maintain your role there, while also taking on the director position with us. Think of it as expanding your reach rather than changing your focus. After we ended the call, I sat in my car for several minutes, watching the last few lights turn off in the office building across the street. A year ago, I'd been a woman whose family had abandoned her at an airport, who'd faced major surgery alone, who'd built her entire identity around being useful to people who saw her as expendable. Now I was being offered a 6-figure position based on work I'd created from scratch, work that had grown out of my own recovery journey, and my commitment to ensuring that other cardiac patients received the support I'd had to fight to find for myself. I thought about Monica's visit that morning, her assumption that I'd want to include family in my professional success, regardless of whether they'd earned a place there. I thought about her prediction that professional achievements wouldn't replace family relationships, as if the two were mutually exclusive. What Monica didn't understand was that I hadn't replaced family relationships. I'd simply stopped accepting relationships that existed entirely on other people's terms. I'd stopped being grateful for scraps of attention from people who should have been offering full meals of support. The family I'd built through my recovery process, through Second Chances, through my advocacy work, was based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine care. These people showed up for each other, not because they were obligated to, but because they wanted to. They celebrated each other's successes without looking for ways to benefit from them. They offered support during crises, without keeping score of who owed what to whom. I started my car and drove home through the familiar streets of Colorado Springs, past the high school where I'd taught for so many years, past the neighborhood where Monica and Derek lived with Emma, past the medical complex where my cardiologist had first delivered the news that changed everything. My house felt peaceful when I walked inside, not empty or lonely as it had for so many years, but genuinely peaceful. I made myself a cup of herbal tea and sat on my back porch, looking up at the stars and thinking about the choice I'd been offered. Taking the position with Presbyterian St. Joseph would mean expanding my advocacy work exponentially. It would mean training other hospitals, developing programs that could help thousands of cardiac patients, having resources and support staff that could amplify everything I'd learned about effective patient care. It would also mean stepping even further away from the small, safe life I'd been living before my heart attack. It would mean embracing a version of myself that I was still getting used to, the version who spoke publicly about difficult topics, who started organizations, who turned down family members who wanted to benefit from her success without contributing to it. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Dr. Ross's number. It was late, but I knew she often worked evening hours to accommodate patients who couldn't attend daytime appointments. She answered on the second ring. Faye! I was hoping I'd hear from you soon. Did Dr. Martinez call? She did, I said. Amanda, can I ask you something honestly? Do you think I'm qualified for a position like this? A year ago, I was a high school teacher who'd never worked in healthcare, never managed a budget, never spoken publicly about anything more controversial than homework policies. Dr. Ross laughed, but it was warm rather than dismissive. Faye, you've created a cardiac patient advocacy program that other hospitals are studying as a model. You've spoken at medical conferences, written articles for professional journals, and helped dozens of patients navigate the most challenging period of their lives. What more qualifications do you need? But I don't have an advanced degree in healthcare administration or nonprofit management or any of the things that usually qualify people for director-level positions. You have something better, Dr. Ross said. You have authentic experience, genuine passion, and a track record of results. You understand what cardiac patients need because you've been one. You know how to build effective support systems because you've had to create your own. You've demonstrated leadership by starting an organization from scratch and making it successful. I sipped my tea and considered her words. For so many years, I'd thought of myself as someone who was qualified only for the specific role I'd already been doing. Teaching it felt safe because I'd been trained for it, certified for it, experienced in it. Everything else had felt like territory I had no right to enter. But my heart attack had forced me to enter unfamiliar territory, and I'd discovered that I was capable of much more than I'd ever allowed myself to imagine. There's something else, Dr. Ross continued. Dr. Martinez mentioned that part of this position would involve developing training programs for family members of cardiac patients, teaching them how to provide effective support, how to recognize when their loved one needs professional help, how to balance their own needs with their caregiving responsibilities. I felt something click into place in my mind. Training programs for families? Exactly. We've realized that a lot of cardiac patients struggle not because they don't have family support, but because their families don't know how to provide effective support. They mean well, but they often end up being more hindrance than help. I thought about Monica and Derek, about their assumption that they'd provided support by driving me to the airport, and their confusion when I'd pointed out that they'd abandoned me there. I thought about all the patients I'd worked with, whose families had similar blind spots, people who equated good intentions with good outcomes. What kind of training are you thinking about? Communication skills, mostly. How to ask what someone needs rather than assuming. How to offer practical help rather than just emotional platitudes. How to recognize when someone is struggling even if they're not asking for help. Basic stuff, but apparently not obvious stuff. After we ended the call, I remained on my porch for another hour, thinking about the opportunity and what it would mean for my life. Taking the position would require me to step even further into my identity as someone who'd not only survived a major health crisis, but had transformed it into a platform for helping others. It would also require me to let go of any remaining hope that my relationship with Monica could return to what it had been before my heart attack. Not because I was angry or vengeful, but because I'd outgrown the dynamic that had defined our relationship for so many years. The next morning, I called Dr. Martinez and accepted the position. The conversation with my staff at Second Chances was emotional but ultimately positive. Jennifer, my assistant, was excited about the opportunity to manage more complex programs. Dr. Ross agreed to serve as interim medical director while we hired someone permanent. The board members I'd recruited over the past year expressed confidence that the organization was strong enough to continue growing even as my role evolved. Robert, Carmen, and Frank took me out to dinner to celebrate, and their enthusiasm reminded me of how different this felt from family celebrations I had experienced in the past. These people were genuinely happy for my success because they cared about me as a person, not because they were calculating how my achievements might benefit them. I didn't tell Monica about the new position. Not out of spite, but because I'd learned that sharing good news with people who couldn't celebrate it wholeheartedly was emotionally draining. I'd rather save my excitement for people who could match it. 3 weeks later, I was moving into my new office at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, meeting my staff, and beginning the process of expanding cardiac patient advocacy throughout their hospital system. The work was challenging and demanding, but it felt like a natural extension of everything I'd been building since my recovery began. On my second day in the new position, I received an email that surprised me. It was from Emma, Monica's daughter, now 15 years old, and apparently able to contact me without her parents' supervision. "Dear Aunt Faye," the email began. "I saw the article about your new job in the newspaper. Mom seemed upset about it, but I think it's really cool. I've been thinking about what I want to study in college, and I'm interested in healthcare, maybe nursing or social work. I was wondering if you'd be willing to tell me about your work sometime. I know things have been weird between you and Mom, but I'd really like to understand what you do and why it's important. Love, Emma." I stared at the email for several minutes, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Emma had been 8 years old when I'd had my heart attack, probably too young to fully understand the family dynamics that had led to my estrangement from her parents. But she was old enough now to form her own opinions about what had happened and what she wanted her relationship with me to look like. I wrote back immediately, telling her I'd love to talk with her about my work and suggesting that we meet for coffee the following weekend. I also mentioned that she was welcome to visit my office at the hospital if she was interested in seeing the patient advocacy programs in action. Her response came back within an hour. "Yes, I'd love to see your office. Can I bring my friend Jessica? She wants to be a doctor, and I think she'd be really interested in what you do." As I scheduled the visit with Emma and her friend, I realized something significant had shifted in my understanding of family relationships. I'd spent so much time focusing on the family members who'd disappointed me that I'd almost overlooked the ones who might still surprise me in positive ways. Emma had chosen to reach out on her own, driven by genuine curiosity about my work, rather than by any expectation of personal benefit. She'd acknowledged the tension between me and her parents without letting it prevent her from maintaining her own relationship with me. Maybe the definition of family wasn't as fixed as I'd thought. Maybe it was possible to maintain connections with some members while setting boundaries with others. Maybe it was possible to have family relationships that were based on mutual respect and genuine interest, rather than just biological connection and social obligation. The following Saturday, Emma and Jessica visited my office at the hospital. They asked thoughtful questions about patient advocacy, took notes about healthcare career paths, and seemed genuinely impressed by the scope of the programs we'd developed. As they were preparing to leave, Emma said something that caught me off guard. "Aunt Faye, I know Mom thinks you changed after your heart attack, and she talks about it like it's a bad thing. But from where I'm sitting, it seems like you just became more yourself. Like you stopped hiding who you really were." I looked at my niece, this almost adult who'd managed to see something that her mother had missed entirely, and felt a profound sense of hope about the future of our relationship. "That's exactly what happened," I said. "I stopped trying to be who other people needed me to be and started figuring out who I actually was." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's what I want to do too. Not the heart attack part, obviously, but the part about becoming more myself instead of just trying to make everyone else comfortable." After they left, I sat in my office thinking about the complexity of family relationships and the possibility that some connections could survive and even thrive despite major changes in family dynamics. Emma had chosen to see my transformation as positive growth rather than betrayal. She'd chosen to maintain a relationship with me based on who I'd become rather than mourning who I'd been. Maybe that was the key to navigating family relationships as an adult, being willing to let some connections evolve while letting others fade, being open to surprises from unexpected sources while maintaining boundaries with people who couldn't accept your growth. I was learning that building a life that worked for me didn't require burning bridges with everyone from my past. It just required being selective about which bridges were worth maintaining and which relationships deserved my continued investment. The work at Presbyterian St. Joseph was everything Dr. Martinez had promised and more. Within 3 months, we'd expanded the peer support program to all 4 hospitals in their system. We'd trained over 60 staff members in patient advocacy techniques. We'd developed family education programs that were being replicated by hospitals in other states. But the most rewarding part of the work was still the direct patient contact. Every week, I spent time in the cardiac units, talking with patients and their families, helping them navigate the complex medical system, advocating for their needs with medical staff. One afternoon, I was called to the bedside of a woman named Ruth who'd had a heart attack at age 68. She was alone, her adult children lived in other states, and she was frightened about the recovery process. As I sat with her, explaining the rehabilitation options and connecting her with resources, she grabbed my hand and said something that reminded me why this work mattered so much. "Thank you for treating me like a person instead of just a medical case," she said. "The doctors are wonderful, but they talk about my heart like it's a machine they're fixing. You talk about my life like it matters." I squeezed her hand and told her that her life absolutely mattered, that her recovery mattered, that she deserved comprehensive support during this difficult time. As I spoke, I thought about my own recovery journey, about the people who'd made me feel seen and valued during my most vulnerable moments. This was what I'd been meant to do, I realized. Not teaching high school English, though I'd enjoyed that work. Not being the reliable sister who absorbed other people's problems without expecting support in return. This work, this advocacy, this commitment to ensuring that other people received the care and support I'd had to fight to find for myself. Walking out of the hospital that evening, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the direction my life had taken. The choices I'd made since my heart attack hadn't been easy, and they'd cost me some relationships I'd thought were important. But they'd led me to work that felt meaningful, relationships that were reciprocal, and a sense of myself that was authentic rather than performative. I thought about the woman who'd stood in Denver International Airport 18 months earlier, abandoned by her family and terrified of facing surgery alone. I thought about how that abandonment had ultimately led to every good thing that had happened since. The discovery of financial resources I'd never known I had. The cardiac rehabilitation program that had introduced me to genuine friendship. The advocacy work that had become my calling. The new position that was allowing me to expand my impact exponentially. My new role at Presbyterian St. Joseph brought unexpected challenges that went far beyond patient advocacy. 3 months into the position, I discovered that effective healthcare reform required navigating institutional politics I hadn't anticipated. The cardiac department was progressive and supportive, but other departments viewed patient advocacy as unnecessary interference with established medical protocols. Dr. Harrison, the chief of surgery, called me into his office on a Thursday morning. He was a man in his early 60s, with the kind of authoritative presence that suggested he'd never been questioned about anything in his professional life. His office was lined with diplomas, awards, and photos of himself with various medical luminaries. "Ms. Alexander," he began without preamble, "I've been hearing about some concerns regarding your patient advocacy protocols." I sat across from his imposing desk, keeping my expression neutral. "What kind of concerns?" "Several of my surgical staff have mentioned that families are becoming more demanding, asking more questions, questioning treatment recommendations. They're saying that your programs are encouraging patients to be adversarial rather than compliant." I felt my chest tighten slightly, the way it did when I encountered situations that reminded me of being dismissed or minimized. But unlike the woman who'd sat quietly while being sent to a basement during her own birthday party, I'd learned to respond to dismissal with clarity rather than submission. "Dr. Harrison, can you give me a specific example of what you'd consider adversarial behavior?" He shuffled through some papers on his desk. "Yesterday, a family questioned why their father was being discharged after only 3 days following bypass surgery. They wanted to know about infection rates, readmission statistics, and alternative care options. They had a list of questions that was clearly prepared in advance." I nodded thoughtfully. "And what was problematic about that?" Dr. Harrison looked at me as if the answer should be obvious. "It takes valuable time to address unnecessary concerns. It undermines the medical team's expertise. It creates anxiety where there should be trust. Dr. Harrison, that family was following recommendations from our pre-surgery education program. We teach families to prepare questions in advance because patients are often too medicated or overwhelmed to advocate for themselves immediately after surgery." "That's exactly my point," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're teaching families to be suspicious of medical recommendations instead of trusting the expertise of their healthcare team." I took a slow breath, recognizing this conversation as a pivotal moment in my professional development. I could apologize, modify our programs to be less empowering, try to find a compromise that would keep Dr. Harrison comfortable. Or I could stand firm in my conviction that informed patients deserved comprehensive information about their care. Dr. Harrison, I'm teaching families to be informed advocates for their loved ones. Research consistently shows that informed patients have better outcomes, higher satisfaction rates, and fewer post-surgical complications. Are you asking me to discourage families from seeking information about their loved one's care? His expression darkened. I'm asking you to remember that this is a medical institution, not a patient rights organization. Our job is to provide excellent medical care, not to cater to every anxiety and demand from uninformed family members. With respect, sir, those uninformed family members are often the primary caregivers during recovery. If they don't understand the care plan, medication requirements, or warning signs of complications, patient safety is compromised. Dr. Harrison stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. I want you to revise your family education materials to emphasize cooperation with medical staff, rather than questioning medical recommendations. Have the revised materials on my desk by Monday. I left his office feeling a familiar sensation, the same feeling I'd had after being relegated to the basement during my birthday party. The difference was that now I recognized the feeling as a signal that I was being asked to compromise my values to make someone else more comfortable, and I'd learned that such compromises rarely led to anything positive. Instead of revising our education materials, I spent the weekend researching patient advocacy standards, medical ethics guidelines, and legal precedents regarding informed consent. I also reached out to Dr. Martinez, who'd hired me, to discuss the situation. Dr. Martinez listened carefully to my account of the conversation, asked several clarifying questions, and then said something that surprised me. Faye, I hired you specifically because you wouldn't back down from situations like this. We've needed someone willing to challenge institutional resistance to patient-centered care. Dr. Harrison represents old-school medical paternalism that assumes patients and families should defer to medical authority without question. So you're not asking me to modify our programs? I'm asking you to document everything, prepare a presentation for the medical staff about the evidence supporting patient advocacy, and let me handle Dr. Harrison directly. This conversation was inappropriate, and his demands violate both hospital policy and patient rights standards. That Monday morning, instead of submitting revised materials to Dr. Harrison, I presented a comprehensive review of our patient advocacy outcomes to the hospital's Quality Improvement Committee. The data was compelling. Patients in our program had shorter average lengths of stay, lower readmission rates, higher satisfaction scores, and fewer post-discharge complications. Dr. Harrison attended the presentation but said nothing during the discussion period. Afterward, several other department heads approached me privately to express interest in expanding patient advocacy services to their units. The experience taught me something important about institutional change and professional courage. For years, I'd avoided conflict by accommodating other people's demands, even when those demands required me to compromise my values or effectiveness. I'd learned to see disagreement as a personal failing rather than a professional necessity. But advocating for cardiac patients had taught me that some conflicts were worth having, that standing firm on important principles was often the only way to create meaningful change. Dr. Harrison's resistance to patient advocacy wasn't about medical expertise. It was about maintaining authority and control in relationships with patients and families. 6 months later, patient advocacy services had been expanded to every department in the hospital system. Dr. Harrison had transferred to another hospital, citing philosophical differences with institutional direction. The nursing staff consistently rated our programs as among the most valuable resources they had for supporting patients and families. More importantly, I'd learned to recognize the difference between reasonable accommodation and inappropriate capitulation. The woman who'd allowed herself to be sent to a basement during her own birthday party would have spent that weekend revising education materials to make Dr. Harrison more comfortable. The woman I'd become understood that some demands weren't worth accommodating. The success of our advocacy programs led to speaking invitations from medical conferences across the country. I found myself addressing audiences of doctors, nurses, hospital administrators, and patient advocacy organizations about the importance of comprehensive patient support systems. During a conference in Seattle, I was approached by Dr. Rachel Chen, a cardiologist from Johns Hopkins who'd attended my presentation about family education programs. Ms. Alexander, I wanted to tell you that your talk today was exactly what our profession needs to hear. Too many of us have been trained to see informed patients as difficult patients, when research clearly shows the opposite. We ended up having coffee together, and Dr. Chen told me about her own research into patient advocacy outcomes. She'd been studying the correlation between family education and post-surgical recovery rates, and her findings supported everything we'd been implementing at Presbyterian St. Joseph. I'd like to collaborate with you on a research study, she said. We could examine patient outcomes across multiple hospital systems, comparing traditional care models with comprehensive advocacy programs. The results could influence national standards for cardiac patient care. I agreed immediately, excited about the opportunity to contribute to medical literature and potentially influence policy at a national level. The research would require me to travel frequently, collecting data from hospitals across the country, but it also represented a chance to validate the work we'd been doing and potentially expand its reach significantly. The collaboration with Dr. Chen marked another turning point in my professional development. I was no longer just a heart attack survivor who'd created a successful local program. I was becoming a recognized expert in patient advocacy, whose work was contributing to national conversations about healthcare reform. But the professional success also brought personal challenges I hadn't anticipated. The travel schedule was demanding, and I found myself away from Colorado Springs for several days each month. The speaking engagements, while rewarding, required emotional energy as I repeatedly shared my own story of abandonment and recovery with audiences of strangers. More significantly, the success seemed to highlight the absence of family support in a way that felt increasingly uncomfortable. At conferences, I'd watch other speakers mention their spouses, children, or siblings who'd supported their career development. I'd receive congratulations from colleagues who assumed I must have family members who were proud of my achievements. During a conference in Chicago, I was having dinner with several other speakers when the conversation turned to work-life balance and family support. Dr. Sarah Williams, a renowned cardiac surgeon, talked about how her husband had supported her through medical school and residency by managing household responsibilities and childcare. I could never have achieved what I have without my family's support, she said. They've made sacrifices to enable my career, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. Others shared similar stories about spouses who'd relocated for their careers, parents who'd provided childcare during demanding training periods, siblings who'd offered emotional support during difficult professional challenges. When the conversation turned to me, I found myself saying, "My family situation is different. I've built my support system through professional relationships and friendships, rather than family connections." Dr. Williams looked curious. That must be challenging. Do you have family in Colorado? I hesitated, unsure how much personal information to share in a professional setting. I have a sister, but we have different perspectives on family relationships and professional priorities. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I spent the rest of the evening thinking about the isolation that sometimes accompanied my professional success. I'd built a meaningful career helping other people navigate healthcare challenges, but I was navigating my own life without the family support that most people took for granted. That night, alone in my hotel room, I called Emma. She was now a junior in high school, focused on college applications and increasingly independent from her parents' supervision. Our relationship had continued to develop over the past year, with regular coffee meetings and occasional visits to my office. "Aunt Faye," she said when she answered, "how's the conference going?" I told her about the presentations I'd attended, the research collaboration I was developing, and the networking opportunities that might lead to additional speaking engagements. "That sounds amazing," Emma said. "I can't believe how much your life has changed since your heart attack. I mean, I know it was terrible at the time, but look at everything you've accomplished." Her words reminded me of something I'd been thinking about during the conference discussions about family support. Emma had become a source of genuine encouragement and pride in my achievements, someone who celebrated my successes without calculating how they might benefit her. "Emma, can I ask you something? Do your parents ever talk about my work, about the advocacy programs, or the speaking engagements?" There was a pause, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "Mom mentions it sometimes, but usually in the context of how much you've changed. She talks about it like you're a different person, and not necessarily in a good way. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. And what do you think? I think you're the same person you always were, just in circumstances that let you show more of who you really are. When I was little, you always seemed like you were holding back, like you were afraid to take up too much space. Now you seem like yourself, if that makes sense. Emma's observation was remarkably insightful for someone her age, and it helped me understand something I'd been struggling to articulate. My professional success hadn't changed my fundamental character. It had simply provided an environment where my natural abilities and interests could flourish without constraint. Emma, I want you to know that having you in my life means a lot to me. Even though things are complicated with your parents, you've been a source of real happiness and pride for me. You mean a lot to me too, Aunt Faye. You've shown me that it's possible to build a life that actually fits who you are, instead of just accepting whatever circumstances you're born into. After we ended the call, I felt a sense of peace about my family situation that I hadn't experienced before. I might not have the traditional family support that other professionals described, but I had something equally valuable. A relationship with my niece that was based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation or convenience. The research collaboration with Dr. Chen progressed rapidly over the following months. We collected data from 12 hospital systems across 8 states, comparing patient outcomes in facilities with comprehensive advocacy programs to those with traditional care models. The results were even more compelling than we'd hoped. Patients in hospitals with advocacy programs had 23% shorter average lengths of stay, 31% lower readmission rates, and significantly higher satisfaction scores. Family members reported feeling more confident about post-discharge care and better equipped to recognize potential complications. We submitted our findings to the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the paper was accepted for publication with minimal revisions. The research provided evidence that patient advocacy wasn't just emotionally supportive, but economically beneficial, reducing healthcare costs while improving outcomes. The publication led to additional speaking invitations and consulting opportunities. I was invited to serve on a task force developing national standards for patient advocacy in cardiac care. I was asked to consult with hospital systems interested in implementing comprehensive advocacy programs. The professional recognition was gratifying, but it also brought unexpected personal consequences. A reporter from the Denver Post contacted me about writing a feature article about my transition from high school teacher to nationally recognized patient advocate. During the interview, she asked about my motivation for starting advocacy work, and I found myself telling the story of my abandonment at the airport, my recovery without family support, and my decision to ensure that other patients received comprehensive care. The article was published on a Sunday morning with the headline "From Abandonment to Advocacy: Local Woman Transforms Personal Crisis into National Mission." It included photos from my speaking engagements, quotes from patients I'd helped, and details about the research I'd conducted with Dr. Chen. I was getting ready for work Monday morning when my phone rang. It was Monica, and she sounded upset. "Faye, I just read the article in the Post. I can't believe you told a reporter about our private family business." I sat down heavily, recognizing that this conversation had been inevitable since the article's publication. "Monica, I didn't identify you by name or provide specific details beyond what was necessary to explain my motivation for the work. You told them that your family abandoned you at the airport before surgery. You made us sound like terrible people?" I told them what happened. "I was abandoned at the airport before surgery." "That's factually accurate." Monica's voice rose. "That's not how it happened, and you know it. We had a family commitment that we couldn't break. We thought you understood that." I felt a familiar frustration rising, the same feeling I'd experienced when Dr. Harrison had tried to pressure me into modifying our patient education programs. People who'd behaved badly often tried to rewrite history to make their behavior seem reasonable, and they expected others to participate in that revision. "Monica, whether you had other commitments is irrelevant. The fact remains that I was left at the airport 3 hours before flying across the country for emergency surgery, and no one in my family called to check on me during my hospitalization or recovery." "You're making it sound like we didn't care about you." "I'm making it sound like what actually happened. How you interpret that is up to you." There was a long silence, and then Monica said something that revealed how completely she'd missed the point of everything that had transpired over the past 2 years. Well, now everyone in Denver knows our business, and people are going to think we're awful. Thanks a lot for that. She hung up before I could respond, but I realized that her reaction perfectly illustrated why our relationship had been problematic for so many years. Monica was concerned about how she appeared to strangers who'd read the article, but she'd shown no interest in understanding why I'd felt abandoned or how that experience had shaped my recovery journey. She was upset about the consequences of her behavior being made public, not about the behavior itself or its impact on me. The article generated significant response from readers. I received dozens of emails from heart patients and their families, sharing their own stories of inadequate support during medical crises. I heard from healthcare professionals who wanted to implement similar advocacy programs at their institutions. Most significantly, I heard from adult children who recognized themselves in the story. People who realized they'd provided inadequate support to aging parents during health crises because they'd prioritized their own convenience over their loved ones' needs. One email particularly stood out. It was from a woman named Jennifer, whose father had recently undergone cardiac surgery in Phoenix. Ms. Alexander, reading your story made me realize that I did to my father exactly what your family did to you. I was so focused on managing my own anxiety about his surgery that I failed to provide the practical support he needed. I visited him once in the hospital, then expected him to manage his recovery independently, because that's how I'd always seen him, as someone who could handle anything. Your article made me understand that strength and independence don't mean someone doesn't need support during a medical crisis. I called my father yesterday and asked what he needed, really listened to his answer, and arranged to spend the next 2 weeks helping with his recovery. Thank you for helping me understand the difference between assuming someone is fine and actually ensuring they have what they need. Messages like Jennifer's reminded me why sharing my story publicly had been important, despite the discomfort it caused with my family. If my experience could help other people recognize inadequate support patterns and change their behavior, then the personal cost was worthwhile. The professional opportunities continued to expand beyond anything I'd imagined when I'd first started Second Chances. I was invited to join the board of directors for the American Association of Patient Advocates. I was asked to develop training materials for medical schools interested in incorporating patient advocacy principles into their curricula. A publisher contacted me about writing a book that would combine my personal story with practical guidance for cardiac patients and their families. The book proposal I developed was accepted enthusiastically, and I found myself with a contract to write Heart to Heart, a patient advocate's guide to cardiac recovery and family support. Writing the book required me to examine my experiences with even greater depth and honesty than I'd previously attempted. I had to analyze not just what had happened during my health crisis, but why it had happened, what systemic factors contributed to inadequate family support during medical emergencies, and how other people could avoid similar situations. The process was emotionally challenging but also deeply rewarding. I interviewed dozens of cardiac patients and their families, collecting stories that illustrated both successful support systems and problematic dynamics. I researched cultural factors that influenced family responses to illness, generational differences in healthcare expectations, and communication strategies that could improve family relationships during medical crises. One chapter focused specifically on the phenomenon of family members who disappeared during health emergencies, only to reappear when recovery was successful, or when there were potential benefits to be gained from association with the patient's renewed strength. I called this pattern fair-weather family support and documented how common it was among the patients I'd worked with. Many people had experienced some version of abandonment during their most vulnerable moments, followed by family members who later wanted to take credit for their recovery or benefit from their post-crisis achievements. The book was scheduled for publication in 18 months, but advance copies were distributed to medical professionals and patient advocacy organizations for review. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several reviewers describing it as essential reading for anyone involved in cardiac care. Dr. Martinez, who'd hired me at Presbyterian St. Joseph, wrote a foreword for the book that included this observation. Faye Alexander represents the best possible outcome of a healthcare crisis that initially appeared devastating. Her transformation from abandoned patient to national advocate demonstrates that sometimes our greatest professional contributions emerge from our most personal struggles. The book's impending publication brought additional media attention. I was interviewed for several healthcare podcasts, quoted in articles about patient advocacy trends, and invited to speak at the American Heart Association's national conference. During the Heart Association conference in Orlando, I was approached by Dr. Michael Torres, the organization's president-elect, about a proposition that would represent the culmination of everything I'd been working toward. Ms. Alexander, we've been following your advocacy work and research outcomes with great interest. We're developing a new initiative focused on comprehensive patient and family support during cardiac events, and we'd like you to serve as the national director. I felt my pulse quicken as he described the position. It would involve developing advocacy standards for hospitals nationwide, training programs for medical professionals, and educational resources for patients and families. The role would require relocating to Dallas and managing a team of 12 professionals. This would be a significant step up from your current position, Dr. Torres continued. You'd be influencing cardiac care policy at a national level, working directly with hospital systems, insurance companies, and government agencies to improve patient support standards. The salary he mentioned was nearly double what I was earning at Presbyterian St. Joseph. More importantly, the position would allow me to influence cardiac patient care throughout the country, potentially helping thousands of people receive the kind of comprehensive support I'd had to fight to find for myself. But accepting the position would mean leaving Colorado Springs, leaving the organization I'd built, leaving the relationships that had sustained me through my recovery and professional development. It would mean starting over in a new city, building new professional relationships, adapting to a much larger institutional structure. As Dr. Torres described the position in greater detail, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I'd been a high school English teacher whose family had abandoned her at an airport before emergency surgery. I'd rebuilt my life from that devastating low point, creating meaningful work that helped other people avoid the isolation I'd experienced. Now I was being offered the opportunity to influence healthcare policy at the highest levels, to ensure that patient advocacy became a standard component of cardiac care rather than an innovative exception. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family members who'd been too busy to provide support during my health crisis would now be able to claim association with someone who'd achieved national recognition in healthcare advocacy. Monica could tell people that her sister was the national director of patient advocacy for the American Heart Association, conveniently omitting the part about abandoning me when I needed support most. But their potential pride or claims of association didn't factor into my decision-making process anymore. I'd learned to make choices based on my own values and aspirations, rather than on how those choices might affect other people's comfort or convenience. After the conference, I returned to Colorado Springs to think seriously about the opportunity and what it would mean for my life. I talked with Dr. Martinez about the transition process at Presbyterian St. Joseph, discussing how my current responsibilities could be transferred to other staff members. I met with the Board of Second Chances to explore how the organization could continue operating effectively in my absence. We discussed the possibility of hiring a full-time executive director, while I maintained an advisory role from Dallas. Most importantly, I had a long conversation with Emma about how the move would affect our relationship. She was now a senior in high school, planning to attend college in California the following fall. "Aunt Faye, you have to take this job," she said when I explained the opportunity. "This is exactly what you've been working toward, and you'd be crazy not to accept it. But it would mean I'm not here for your senior year, for graduation, for all the college preparation activities." Emma smiled with the kind of wisdom that surprised me consistently. "You've already been here for me in all the ways that matter. You've shown me what it looks like to build a life around your values instead of just accepting whatever circumstances you're given. Taking this job is exactly the kind of choice you've taught me to make." The conversation with Emma helped me realize that my reluctance to accept the position wasn't really about leaving Colorado Springs or changing my current work situation. It was about a lingering fear that success would isolate me further from family relationships, that achieving recognition at a national level would make it even more difficult to maintain personal connections. But Emma's response reminded me that authentic relationships survived, and even thrived, despite geographic distance or professional changes. The people who truly cared about me would celebrate my success regardless of how it affected their own convenience. The people who only valued me when I was available to meet their needs weren't worth organizing my life around. I called Dr. Torres the following week and accepted the position as National Director of Patient Advocacy for the American Heart Association. The decision felt both terrifying and inevitable, like the natural conclusion of a journey that had begun with abandonment at an airport and led to national recognition for work I'd never imagined myself capable of doing. As I began preparing for the transition to Dallas, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since my heart attack. I'd transformed from someone who derived her identity from being useful to others into someone who'd created a career based on her own interests and expertise. I'd learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between providing support and receiving it, between accommodating other people's demands and setting boundaries that protected my own well-being. Most importantly, I discovered that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you creates space for the best thing to happen to you, but only if you're willing to use that space to build something entirely new rather than trying to recreate what you'd lost. The family that had abandoned me at the airport had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible. They'd forced me to discover who I was when I wasn't trying to be useful to them. And it turned out that person was capable of much more than any of us had ever imagined. The move to Dallas represented more than just a career advancement. It was a complete reinvention of how I understood my place in the world. My new office at the American Heart Association headquarters occupied the 23rd floor of a gleaming tower in the medical district, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling cityscape of North Texas. My first day in the national director role, I stood at those windows drinking my morning coffee and thinking about the scope of what lay ahead. I would be responsible for developing patient advocacy standards that would eventually be implemented in over 3,000 hospitals across the United States. The policies I created would influence how cardiac patients and their families were supported during some of the most vulnerable moments of their lives. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. 3.5 years ago, I'd been a woman whose own family couldn't be bothered to provide basic support during a medical emergency. Now I was tasked with ensuring that no cardiac patient in America would have to navigate their recovery without comprehensive advocacy services. My team consisted of 12 experienced professionals, including former nurses, social workers, hospital administrators, and policy analysts. During our first team meeting, I looked around the conference table at these accomplished individuals who would be helping me implement programs nationwide, and I felt a moment of imposter syndrome that took me by surprise. Dr. Linda Vasquez, my deputy director, must have sensed my hesitation because she addressed it directly during our one-on-one meeting later that day. "Faye, I've reviewed your background extensively, and I want you to know that you're exactly the right person for this position. You have something that most healthcare administrators lack: authentic patient experience, combined with proven leadership abilities." She pulled out a thick folder containing research studies, program evaluations, and testimonials from hospitals that had implemented advocacy programs based on my work in Colorado. "Look at these outcomes," she said, spreading the documents across my desk. Patient satisfaction scores increased by an average of 34% in hospitals using your advocacy model. Length of stay decreased by 18%. Readmission rates dropped by 22%. These aren't just good numbers. They're exceptional results that have saved millions of dollars in healthcare costs while dramatically improving patient experiences. Dr. Vasquez leaned back in her chair and fixed me with a direct gaze. "More importantly, you understand what patients actually need because you've been where they are. You've experienced inadequate family support during a medical crisis, and you've used that experience to ensure other people receive better care. That combination of personal experience and professional competence is exactly what this position requires." Her words helped me understand something I'd been struggling to articulate about my career trajectory. My professional success hadn't happened despite my abandonment by family during my health crisis. It had happened because of it. The experience had given me insights into patient needs that couldn't be learned from textbooks or training programs. The first major initiative I tackled was developing comprehensive training materials for hospital staff about identifying and addressing inadequate family support systems. Too many medical professionals assumed that having family members present meant having adequate support, when research showed that the quality of family support varied dramatically. I worked with Dr. Vasquez and our team to create assessment tools that would help healthcare workers recognize when families were providing emotional support but lacking practical knowledge, when family members were creating additional stress rather than alleviating it, and when patients were essentially managing their recovery alone despite having relatives involved in their care. The training materials included case studies based on real situations I'd encountered, though all identifying details were removed to protect patient confidentiality. One case study described a cardiac patient whose adult children visited daily, but spent their time discussing their own anxiety about their father's condition, rather than learning about his care needs. Another described a woman whose husband attended all medical appointments but consistently contradicted her questions and concerns, effectively silencing her during interactions with medical staff. These scenarios helped healthcare workers understand that family presence didn't automatically translate to effective support, and that patients sometimes needed advocacy services to navigate family dynamics that were hindering rather than helping their recovery. The response to our training program exceeded all expectations. Within 6 months, over 400 hospitals had requested implementation of our advocacy standards. Medical schools began incorporating our patient support assessment tools into their curricula. Nursing programs started requiring coursework in family dynamics and patient advocacy techniques. But the most meaningful feedback came from individual patients and families who'd benefited from the improved support services. I received hundreds of letters and emails from people describing how comprehensive advocacy had transformed their healthcare experience. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a woman named Patricia, whose husband had undergone emergency cardiac surgery at a hospital in Memphis that had recently implemented our advocacy program. Ms. Alexander, I wanted you to know that your advocacy protocols saved my husband's life, and probably our marriage too. When James had his heart attack, I was so terrified that I couldn't think clearly about anything practical. I kept asking the wrong questions, focusing on my own fears instead of his actual needs. The patient advocate assigned to us helped me understand what James needed from me during his recovery. She taught me how to ask helpful questions instead of just expressing my anxiety. She helped me create a care plan that addressed his medical needs while also acknowledging my limitations as a caregiver. Most importantly, she helped me understand that being a good advocate for my husband meant taking care of my own emotional health so I could be present for him without adding to his stress. I learned that love isn't just about being worried, it's about being useful in ways that actually help the person you love. Without that guidance, I would have continued being an anxious, hovering presence who meant well but made everything harder for James. Instead, I became someone who could provide practical support while managing my own fears privately. James says that having me as a calm, informed advocate made his recovery much easier than he'd expected. Thank you for creating programs that don't just help patients but help families learn how to be truly supportive instead of just emotionally reactive. Letters like Patricia's reminded me daily why this work mattered beyond statistics and policy implementation. Every family that learned to provide effective support instead of well-intentioned interference represented a cardiac patient who would recover in an environment of genuine care rather than anxious chaos. 8 months into my role at the American Heart Association, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee examining healthcare cost reduction strategies. The invitation came because our patient advocacy programs had demonstrated significant financial benefits alongside improved patient outcomes. Preparing for congressional testimony required extensive coordination with policy analysts, healthcare economists, and legal experts. I spent weeks reviewing economic impact studies, memorizing statistics about cost savings, and practicing responses to potential questions about program implementation and funding. The day of the testimony, I sat at a table, facing a panel of senators and representatives in a hearing room that felt both intimidating and surreal. 2 years earlier, I'd been nervous about speaking to a support group of 12 cardiac patients. Now I was addressing federal lawmakers about healthcare policy that could affect millions of Americans. Senator Margaret Chen from California, who chaired the subcommittee, opened the questioning by asking me to summarize the economic benefits of comprehensive patient advocacy programs. Senator Chen, our research demonstrates that hospitals implementing comprehensive patient advocacy services see an average cost reduction of $3,200 per cardiac patient due to shorter lengths of stay, fewer readmissions, and reduced complications. When extrapolated across the approximately 800,000 cardiac procedures performed annually in the United States, comprehensive advocacy could save the healthcare system over $2.5 billion per year. Senator Robert Martinez from Texas followed up by asking about implementation challenges and costs. Senator Martinez: the average cost of implementing our advocacy program is approximately $150,000 per hospital in the first year, including staff training, materials development, and system integration. The average savings per hospital exceed $400,000 annually, providing a return on investment of nearly 300%, while significantly improving patient experiences and outcomes. But the most challenging question came from Representative David Wilson from Florida, who seemed skeptical about the necessity of formalized advocacy programs. Ms. Alexander, aren't you essentially asking hospitals to pay for services that families should be providing naturally? Shouldn't relatives be capable of supporting their loved ones during medical crises without professional intervention? I recognized the question as an opportunity to address misconceptions that I'd encountered frequently throughout my advocacy work. Representative Wilson, that's an excellent question that highlights a common misunderstanding about family support during medical crises. Many families want to provide effective support, but lack the knowledge and skills to do so appropriately. Consider this analogy. Most people want to help during a house fire, but we don't expect them to fight the fire themselves. We train firefighters to handle emergencies effectively while coordinating with concerned family members in ways that help rather than hinder the response. Medical emergencies create similar dynamics. Family members are often overwhelmed by their own anxiety and lack practical knowledge about medical care. Without guidance, they can inadvertently create additional stress for patients or interfere with medical protocols despite having the best intentions. Patient advocacy programs don't replace family support. They enhance it by helping relatives become more effective advocates and caregivers. Representative Wilson nodded thoughtfully. Can you give me a specific example of how untrained family support might actually harm patient outcomes? Certainly. I frequently encounter families who express their anxiety by asking repetitive questions that increase patient stress, who contradict medical instructions because they don't understand the rationale, or who focus on their own emotional needs rather than the patient's practical requirements during recovery. For instance, a well-meaning spouse might insist that their partner eat foods that contradict dietary restrictions because they're worried about weight loss. Or adult children might overwhelm a recovering parent with visits and demands for attention when the patient needs quiet rest. Advocacy programs teach families how to channel their concern into genuinely helpful behaviors while managing their own anxiety in ways that don't burden the patient. The testimony session lasted nearly 3 hours, and afterward, several legislators approached me privately to discuss potential federal funding for patient advocacy programs. The attention was flattering, but it also made me aware of how far-reaching the implications of my work had become. Walking out of the Capitol building that afternoon, I called Emma to share the experience. She was now a sophomore at Stanford, studying pre-med with a focus on healthcare policy, and our conversations had evolved into genuine intellectual exchanges about medical ethics and patient care. Aunt Faye, that's incredible. You just testified before Congress about programs you created. Do you realize how amazing that is? Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself laughing with genuine joy about the surreal nature of my current life. Emma, sometimes I can't believe this is real. 4 years ago, I thought my biggest professional achievement would be getting tenure at Roosevelt High School. Now I'm influencing healthcare policy at a federal level. You know what I think is the most amazing part? Emma said. You didn't set out to become a healthcare advocate or policy expert. You just decided to solve a problem you'd experienced personally, and that led to everything else. Her observation reminded me of something I'd been thinking about frequently: the unplanned nature of meaningful career development. I'd never strategically positioned myself to become a patient advocate or policy expert. I'd simply refused to accept inadequate support systems as inevitable, and that refusal had led to opportunities I couldn't have imagined. The congressional testimony generated significant media attention, including a feature article in the Washington Post about patient advocacy as a cost-effective healthcare reform strategy. The article mentioned my background as a heart attack survivor who'd transformed personal experience into national policy influence. 3 days after the article was published, I received a phone call that I'd been half expecting for months. Faye, it's Monica. I just read the article about your congressional testimony. I was in my office reviewing budget projections for the next fiscal year, and Monica's call interrupted my concentration in a way that felt both jarring and inevitable. Hello, Monica. How are you? I'm fine, but I wanted to talk to you about something. Derek and I have been discussing your career success, and we think it might be time for us to have a conversation about rebuilding our relationship. I set down the budget documents and gave her my full attention, curious about where this conversation would lead. What kind of conversation did you have in mind? Well, we realized that maybe we haven't been as supportive as we could have been during your health crisis and career transition. We were dealing with our own stress at the time, but we can see now that you might have needed more from us. I noted her careful phrasing, the way she framed their abandonment as insufficient support rather than active neglect, and her suggestion that I might have needed more, rather than acknowledging that I definitely needed basic family support during a life-threatening health crisis. Monica, I appreciate you calling. What's prompted this reflection about our relationship? There was a pause, and I could sense her trying to decide how honest to be about her motivations. Honestly, Faye, watching your success from a distance has been difficult. You're testifying before Congress, getting written about in national newspapers, influencing healthcare policy. It's amazing, but it also makes us realize that we've missed out on being part of your journey. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same sensation I'd experienced when Dr. Harrison had tried to pressure me into modifying patient education materials. When Monica had first approached me about joining my organization after learning about my inheritance. Monica, when you say you've missed out on being part of my journey, what exactly do you mean? I mean that we should have been there to support you, to celebrate your achievements, to be proud family members who were involved in your success. Her words confirmed what I'd suspected. Monica wasn't calling because she'd developed genuine understanding of how her behavior had affected me during my health crisis. She was calling because she wanted to associate herself with my current success. Monica, can I ask you something? When was the last time you asked me about my work because you were genuinely interested in patient advocacy, rather than because you'd seen media coverage about my career? The question clearly caught her off guard. I've always been interested in your work. When I told you about starting Second Chances, you immediately asked about whether there might be paid positions for you and Derek. When you learned about my inheritance, you focused on the financial implications, rather than asking how I plan to use the resources. When you saw the newspaper article about my advocacy work, you were upset about how it made you look, rather than curious about what I'd accomplished. I kept my voice calm and factual, avoiding accusatory tones while clearly stating the pattern I'd observed. Monica, I don't think you're interested in my work or my journey. I think you're interested in being associated with my success, now that it's visible and impressive to other people. That's not fair, Faye. We're family. Of course we want to be supportive. Family support doesn't begin when someone achieves public recognition. It begins when someone needs help, even if that help isn't convenient or glamorous. Monica's voice took on the defensive edge I remembered from our previous difficult conversations. We did support you. We drove you to the airport. We thought you were managing everything fine. Monica, you left me at the airport 3 hours before emergency surgery and didn't call once during my hospitalization. That's not support, by any reasonable definition. We had other obligations. We couldn't drop everything just because you were having medical problems. Her choice of words, just because you were having medical problems, revealed how fundamentally she still misunderstood the situation. Emergency cardiac surgery wasn't a minor inconvenience that I'd expected them to prioritize over Emma's recital. It was a life-threatening medical crisis that required family support as a basic human decency. Monica, I understand that you had other obligations, but when someone in your family is facing emergency surgery, the appropriate response is to either provide support or explicitly acknowledge that you can't be available. What you can't do is abandon them and then pretend that counts as support. I'm trying to rebuild our relationship here, Faye. I'm acknowledging that maybe we could have done things differently. I appreciate that acknowledgement, but rebuilding a relationship requires understanding what went wrong in the first place. You're still describing your abandonment of me as insufficient support rather than recognizing it as abandonment. There was a long silence, and I could sense Monica's frustration building. She'd called expecting to smooth things over with a partial apology and an offer to be more involved in my current success. She hadn't expected to be confronted with the need to genuinely acknowledge how her behavior had affected me. What do you want from me, Faye? Do you want me to grovel? Do you want me to admit that we're terrible people who don't deserve to be in your life? I want you to understand why I needed support during my health crisis, and why I built a support system that didn't include you. I want you to recognize that family relationships require reciprocity, not just expectation that one person will always be available to meet everyone else's needs. And then what? If I give you the apology you're looking for, then we can go back to being sisters. Her question revealed the transactional way she understood relationships, as if acknowledging past behavior was simply a requirement for accessing future benefits. Monica, I don't want a performative apology. I want you to understand that I've built a life that works for me, relationships that are based on mutual support, and a career that gives me purpose. I'm not looking to go back to anything. I'm happy with what I've built moving forward. So that's it? You're just going to write off your entire family because we weren't perfect during one difficult situation? I'm going to continue prioritizing relationships with people who show up for me consistently, not just when it's convenient or beneficial for them. Monica hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat in my office looking out at the Dallas skyline, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because I'd hoped that maybe Monica had genuinely reflected on our relationship and developed some understanding of how her behavior had affected me. Relief because her call had confirmed that I'd made the right choice in building a life that didn't depend on her approval or involvement. That evening, I called Emma to tell her about the conversation with her mother. I'm not surprised, Emma said after I'd summarized the phone call. Mom's been talking about your success more lately, but always in the context of how it reflects on our family rather than celebrating your achievements for their own sake. How do you feel about the tension between me and your parents? I know it puts you in a difficult position. Emma was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. Aunt Faye, I love my parents, but I also see their limitations clearly. They're good people in many ways, but they've never been able to see past their own needs and perspectives when it comes to family relationships. They expect other people to accommodate their priorities, while offering very little accommodation in return. Her analysis was remarkably mature for a 20-year-old, and it helped me understand that Emma had been observing family dynamics with the same clarity I'd developed during my recovery process. I've learned more about healthy relationships from watching you rebuild your life than I ever learned from the family dynamics I grew up with, she continued. You've shown me that it's possible to set boundaries, pursue your own goals, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Emma, I want you to know that no matter what happens with your parents, you'll always have a place in my life. Our relationship isn't dependent on theirs. I know that, and it means everything to me. You've been the example I needed of what it looks like to live authentically instead of just trying to keep everyone else comfortable. 6 months later, my book Heart to Heart, A Patient Advocate's Guide to Cardiac Recovery and Family Support, was published to significant acclaim. It received positive reviews in medical journals, patient advocacy publications, and general interest magazines. The book became required reading in several nursing programs and was adopted as a resource by hospitals implementing patient advocacy services. The book tour took me to 23 cities over 2 months, speaking at bookstores, medical conferences, patient support groups, and university campuses. At each event, I encountered people who shared their own stories of inadequate family support during medical crises, healthcare workers who wanted to improve their patient advocacy skills, and family members who recognized their own limitations in providing effective support. During a book signing in Seattle, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes and a copy of my book clutched tightly in her hands. Ms. Alexander, I wanted to thank you for writing this. My mother had a stroke 6 months ago, and I've been trying to help with her recovery, but I've been doing everything wrong. I've been focusing on my own anxiety instead of her actual needs. Your book helped me understand how to be genuinely helpful instead of just emotionally reactive. She opened the book to a page she'd marked with several sticky notes. This chapter about the difference between supportive presence and anxious hovering completely changed how I approach my mother's care. I realized I'd been making her recovery harder by constantly expressing my worry instead of learning what she actually needed from me. Conversations like this one reminded me why sharing my story publicly had been important, despite the personal cost. Every person who learned to provide more effective family support represented a patient who would recover in an environment of genuine care, rather than well-intentioned chaos. The success of the book led to additional opportunities that I hadn't anticipated. I was invited to serve on the advisory board for the National Institute of Health's Patient Advocacy Initiative. I was asked to develop training materials for medical schools across the country. I received consulting offers from hospitals, insurance companies, and healthcare technology firms. Most significantly, I was approached by Dr. Rebecca Thompson, the Dean of the University of Texas Medical School, about creating the first endowed chair in patient advocacy at a major medical institution. "Faye, we want to establish the Alexander Chair in Patient Advocacy and Family Support," she said during our meeting in her office, overlooking the medical center campus. This would be a permanent faculty position focused on research, education, and policy development in patient advocacy. You would be the first person to hold the chair, and you'd have complete autonomy to develop the program according to your vision. The position would involve teaching medical students, conducting research on patient advocacy outcomes, and developing policy recommendations for healthcare institutions. It would also provide a platform for training the next generation of healthcare professionals in patient-centered care principles. Dr. Thompson, I'm honored by the offer, but I should mention that I don't have a traditional academic background. I don't have a PhD or extensive research experience. She smiled and leaned back in her chair. Faye, you have something more valuable than traditional academic credentials: authentic expertise combined with demonstrated impact. You've transformed patient advocacy from a peripheral service into a central component of quality healthcare. You've published research that's influencing national policy. You've written a book that's changing how healthcare professionals think about family support. She pulled out a folder containing letters of support from medical professionals across the country. These are recommendations from colleagues who've worked with you, implemented your programs, or been influenced by your advocacy work. Every single letter emphasizes the same points. Your understanding of patient needs is unparalleled. Your ability to translate that understanding into practical programs is exceptional, and your impact on healthcare quality has been transformative. Dr. Thompson opened the folder and read from one of the letters. Dr. Martinez from Presbyterian St. Joseph writes, Faye Alexander has revolutionized our understanding of what comprehensive patient support requires. Her programs have improved our patient outcomes while reducing costs, but more importantly, they've reminded our staff why we entered healthcare in the first place: to provide compassionate, patient-centered care. Reading through the letters of support, I was struck by how many healthcare professionals had been influenced by work that had grown out of my personal experience of abandonment and recovery. The programs I'd developed to address my own inadequate family support had become tools that were helping thousands of patients receive better care. Accepting the endowed chair would represent the ultimate transformation from abandoned patient to healthcare leader. It would provide a permanent platform for advancing patient advocacy while training future healthcare professionals in comprehensive support principles. But it would also mean leaving my position at the American Heart Association just as we were implementing advocacy standards nationwide. It would mean transitioning from policy implementation to academic research and education. As I considered the decision, I realized that both opportunities represented different ways of advancing the same fundamental mission: ensuring that no cardiac patient would have to navigate their recovery without comprehensive support. I spent 2 weeks visiting the medical school campus, meeting with faculty and students, observing classes and clinical rotations. The environment was intellectually stimulating and mission-driven, filled with people who were passionate about improving healthcare quality and patient outcomes. During a dinner with current faculty members, Dr. Sarah Chen, a cardiologist who'd implemented my advocacy protocols in her practice, made an observation that influenced my final decision. Faye, what you've accomplished through policy implementation has been incredible. but imagine the long-term impact of training hundreds of medical students to understand patient advocacy as a fundamental component of quality care. Every doctor and nurse who learns these principles during their training will carry them throughout their entire career. Her words helped me understand that academic medicine offered a different kind of influence than policy work, but potentially a more sustainable one. Rather than implementing programs in existing healthcare systems, I could help shape the next generation of healthcare professionals to understand patient advocacy as an essential rather than optional component of medical care. I accepted the endowed chair position, beginning what would become the most intellectually challenging and personally fulfilling phase of my career. The transition from policy implementation to academic medicine required me to develop new skills in research methodology, curriculum development, and academic writing. But it also provided an opportunity to influence healthcare culture at its foundation, ensuring that future medical professionals understood that technical competence without comprehensive patient support was inadequate care. My first semester teaching medical students reminded me why this work mattered at such a fundamental level. These bright, motivated young people were learning to navigate complex medical knowledge while developing their professional identities. Teaching them to see patient advocacy as integral to quality care, rather than as an additional burden, would influence thousands of patients throughout their careers. During one class discussion about family dynamics during medical crises, a student named Marcus raised his hand with a question that surprised me. "Professor Alexander, how do you help families understand that good intentions aren't enough if they don't translate into effective support?" His question was sophisticated and demonstrated that he'd been thinking deeply about the material we'd covered. "Marcus, that's an excellent question. I usually start by helping families understand that love and worry aren't the same thing as helpful behavior. You can care deeply about someone while still providing support that makes their situation more difficult." I gave them the example of family members who express their anxiety by asking repetitive questions that increase patient stress, or who focus on their own emotional needs rather than learning what the patient actually requires. The key is teaching families to channel their concern into genuinely helpful behaviors while managing their own anxiety in ways that don't burden the patient. It's about transforming emotional reactivity into practical support. Another student, Jennifer, followed up with a question about my own experience. "Professor, your book mentions that you experienced inadequate family support during your own cardiac event. How did that personal experience influence your approach to patient advocacy?" I'd learned to discuss my personal experience in academic settings in ways that were educational, rather than simply emotional, focusing on the insights I'd gained, rather than the pain I'd experienced. "Jennifer, experiencing abandonment during my health crisis taught me something that I couldn't have learned from textbooks or training programs: the difference between having family members present and having effective family support. It taught me that patients need practical assistance, emotional stability from their support system, and advocacy for their needs within the medical system." I paused, looking around the classroom at these future healthcare professionals who would encounter thousands of patients throughout their careers. Most importantly, it taught me that healthcare providers can't assume that having family involvement means having adequate support. Part of our responsibility as medical professionals is recognizing when families need guidance to provide effective care, and helping them develop the skills to be genuinely helpful, rather than just emotionally present. The discussion that followed was rich and thoughtful, with students sharing observations from their clinical rotations about family dynamics they'd witnessed. They were beginning to understand that patient advocacy wasn't just about medical knowledge, but about understanding the complex social and emotional factors that influenced recovery outcomes. Teaching these medical students felt like the natural culmination of everything I'd learned since my heart attack. I was passing on insights that had been gained through personal struggle, professional development, and extensive research to people who would use that knowledge to provide better care for thousands of patients. The woman who'd been abandoned at an airport before emergency surgery had become someone who was training the next generation of healthcare professionals to ensure that no patient would have to navigate recovery without comprehensive support. As I walked across campus after that class, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The abandonment that had felt so devastating 4 years earlier had ultimately led to a career that was more meaningful and impactful than anything I could have planned or imagined. I'd learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you forces you to discover strengths you never knew you had, pursue opportunities you never would have considered, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than convenience or obligation. The family that had failed to support me during my health crisis had inadvertently given me the motivation to ensure that other families learned to provide effective support. Their abandonment had become the foundation for work that was helping thousands of patients receive better care. In that sense, Monica and Derek's failure to show up for me had led to my showing up for countless other people in ways they never could have imagined. Their inability to provide support had motivated me to become someone who taught others how to provide effective support. I thought about Emma, now thriving at Stanford and planning to pursue a career in healthcare policy. She'd learned from observing my transformation that it was possible to build a life around your values, rather than just accepting whatever circumstances you were given. I thought about the medical students I was teaching, who would carry patient advocacy principles throughout their careers, ensuring that future patients received comprehensive care rather than just medical treatment. I thought about the thousands of patients and families who'd benefited from advocacy programs that had grown out of my personal experience of inadequate support, and the healthcare professionals who'd learned to recognize the difference between family presence and effective family support. The transformation had been complete. I'd evolved from someone who derived her identity from being useful to others into someone who'd created a career based on ensuring that other people received the support they deserved. And I'd learned that sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is their absence from your life, because it forces you to discover who you are when you're not trying to accommodate their needs or manage their limitations. Monica and Derek had disappeared from my life when I needed them most, and in doing so, they'd given me the space to become someone neither of us had ever imagined I could be. That evening, I called Emma to share my thoughts about the day's teaching experience. Aunt Faye, it sounds like everything has come full circle. You went from being a patient who needed advocacy to being someone who trains other people to provide advocacy. Exactly. And the most amazing part is that none of it would have happened if your parents had provided adequate support during my health crisis. Their failure to show up for me created the motivation for me to show up for other people in ways I never could have imagined. Emma was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her processing the complexity of that observation. It's kind of incredible when you think about it, she said finally. Their worst behavior led to your best work. Their inability to support you led to you becoming someone who helps thousands of other people receive support. That's exactly right. And I think there's a lesson in that for anyone who's been disappointed by family members or others they expected to support them. Sometimes the people who fail to show up for you are giving you the opportunity to discover what you're capable of when you stop waiting for their approval or assistance. I'm going to remember that, Emma said, when I'm dealing with my own family limitations or other disappointments. As we ended our call, I realized that my story wasn't just about recovering from a heart attack or building a successful career in patient advocacy. It was about learning that sometimes the most important relationships in your life are the ones you build after the people you expected to support you demonstrate that they can't or won't. It was about discovering that your worth isn't determined by how other people treat you, but by how you choose to respond when their treatment falls short of what you deserve. And it was about understanding that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing you ever do, but only if you're willing to use the pain as motivation rather than letting it define your limitations. The woman who'd been abandoned at Denver International Airport had become someone who would never allow another cardiac patient to face their recovery alone. And in that transformation, I'd found not just professional success, but genuine peace with who I'd become, and gratitude for the journey that had brought me there, even the painful parts that had seemed so devastating at the time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.